rebel force has penetrated the shield and landed on Endor.
This is where the fun begins.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
This is Rebel Force Radio.
Your source for the Force.
Star Wars news and commentary.
With Jason Swank and Jimmy Mack.
I've seen Star Wars 500 times.
Star Wars #1!
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe. I suggest we use it.
Now it's time for Rebel Force Radio.
We would be honored if you would join us.
You know, with Rogue One being back in theaters and, you know, the prequel era sort of being ushered in by a re-release of the original trilogy. And Rogue One, by the way, is doing great as far as IMAX releases go. It's entered now the top 10. Makes me think that they should bring Star Wars back to the theaters every couple of years. I mean, why not? You know, you have all these big May the 4ths, these celebrations, retailers, everybody's getting into the act. Why not let the movie theaters do it and do midnight marathons of the whole Star Wars saga, maybe one trilogy at a time? I don't know. It just seems to me it's a no-brainer. I think you should be able to go to the movie theater at regular times and see Star Wars on the big screen. But no, a lot of you have been out and you've seen Rogue One in IMAX. Jimmy Mack was there with some of the Babu freaks, but something we didn't really get into too much was that exclusive Andor footage, which was sort of dangled like a carrot, you know, give you a reason. As if you need a reason to go see a Star Wars movie in IMAX. We'll see what that footage entailed, if anything. To note, now that most of you have had a chance to see it. And speaking of Rogue One, wow, this is great. Coming up later on in the show, we're going to be in the cantina once more with Rogue One co-writer Gary Whitta. Of course, Gary Whitta wrote the first pass at the Rogue One screenplay based on the story by John Knoll, and then it would later get brushed up by Chris Weitz and Tony Gilroy. Tony Gilroy, you know, the showrunner for Andor. And say who's quasi-ghost directed Rogue One, we might say. And then also Star Wars and pop culture coming on, where we take a look and catch up on Star Wars references happening in some of our favorite entertainment today. And I know someone whose ears are always open to Star Wars references, and that is, of course, my good friend and yours from Chicago, Jimmy Mack.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Star Wars fans. Yeah, Rogue One is back, and so many people have had the opportunity to see it in IMAX. I had the opportunity last weekend, and let's face it, I just went for the fresh footage from Andor and the other sneak peek stuff that they threw in there, and fully thought that I would be offending my fellow theater attendees because I'd be snoring midway through it. Put me in a dark, air-conditioned room and turn the lights down. And I've seen the movie many times.
I mean, is that a commentary on the movie or a commentary on you? Which?
No, it's a commentary on me. It's been a very busy August, let's just say. And
it's hot outside, like you say. You know, you go into that.
Right. And I'd spent the whole day outside at a street fest in the sun, day drinking. And rocking out. So I thought for sure that I would be burnt to a crisp by the time I sat down to see Rogue One. I went with Billy Mack and Tyler Page. Of course, we met up at the pub before the movie. So, I mean, even continued.
Well, that doesn't help.
Yeah, so I thought I'd be out cold when the lights went down after that sneak peek at Andor wrapped up. But I got to be honest with you. I was totally invested in that screening and committed all the way from the opening title card to the end credits. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed seeing Rogue One in the IMAX format because, as everyone remembers, last week I revealed that when Rogue One was initially released at the end of 2016, I had a bout of cataracts, which made my vision very cloudy. And my Rogue One theatrical experience wasn't as good as you'd think, you know. So I was very excited to see it again in IMAX, and stay awake, I did. And it was great. It was just really fun. It was even fun seeing the Andor trailer in the IMAX format.
Yeah.
I got to admit, I think it's been quite a while since I've walked into an IMAX theater. I've been favoring the Dolby theater more lately because it's got like concert-like sound in there. But the IMAX theater was just fantastic to see Rogue One. I think it was the first time for me to go back to IMAX since The Rise of Skywalker. So it's been a while.
Yeah, so let's talk about this footage. You mentioned that the trailer was shown, which we've all seen that, but this
yes.
It said it would be an exclusive look at the series. So what was part of that exclusive footage that they showed?
It was the same scene we saw with Diego Luna and Stellan Skarsgård. Luthen, or is it Luthian?
I think it's Luthen.
But it was expanded. It was much longer.
Okay.
It was expanded, and then there was an edit there, kind of like a crossfade into the same environment, but a gun battle, a blaster fight with stormtroopers, which was really good.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so it just gave you an indication to what the action is going to be like in the Andor series.
Were they clone troopers or were they stormtroopers? Do you recall? Or was it a mixture?
Stormtroopers.
Stormtroopers.
No,
okay.
stormtroopers. From what I can tell,
yeah,
it was just stormtroopers. And then it just segued into the Andor trailer, the most recent one.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was great to see that on the big screen. Yeah, nothing too revealing, but it sort of gave you a taste for what the tone is going to be like in the series. And the action sequence was up to par with Star Wars as we know it, you know. And there was a little Q&A at the beginning of that, which was basically just basic PR blurbs, you know, nothing really too revealing. There is a lot of Andor out there, out on the media trail right now. Press junkets, what have you. I've listened to a few of them, and I mean, really have not heard anything that is not revealing.
No.
I mean, it's like, wow.
I think
what's the series about? Well, it's about a character who's been in this fight since he was 6 years old. How does a 6-year-old get involved in fighting? And who is this person we see in Rogue One? It's like, yeah, this is all just so obvious stuff. We know all this, but I mean, what do we want them to reveal to us before the series even?
They have not been
much.
very forthcoming. Yeah, they haven't been with this. And the biggest clue that I have is that they're making such a big deal, seemingly, over Skarsgård's character, Luthen. He shows up in all the material, and yet he's only credited as being in one episode. Now, that could be wrong, but...
I got some insight into that.
Oh, okay. You called up Stellan?
Because you're talking about IMDb listings specifically.
Yes.
When we say only credited with one episode.
Right.
But...
not that it's never been wrong before. It has been wrong.
I got the heads up from someone who is an associate of someone who works with IMDb. And they say that's kind of like standard protocol before series are released to list side characters, supporting actors as only being in one episode until it gets revealed how many episodes they actually are in. That's sort of like
so they're avoiding that spoiler
template.
Territory. I gotcha.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's like, you know, the default template for IMDb. Mm-hmm. So this came from someone who's an educator and one of their students is an associate with IMDb. And this person said that's, they gave me the lowdown on how that happens. So.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So he very well could be a fixture in the whole series. I would think with an actor of his weight and the fact that, again, he's shown up in everything that, he likely is going to be a major character in the show, and likely be the connection between the Mon Mothma plotline and the Cassian Andor plotline until they intersect.
I think we've seen footage of him with both characters, so that makes a lot of sense.
With two different hairdos and all that. You know, you mentioned about the darkness gem with Rogue One, and I was thinking about and the tone and the carryover into Andor, and I was just reviewing the last two episodes of the Icons Unearthed documentary, and thinking about that quote that Phil Tippett gives when George apparently told Phil at one point about what his plans for the prequel trilogy were. And he used, descriptors like Cloak and Dagger, The Godfather, a darker story. And he thought that was, that sounded really cool. And then, he relents and says, obviously, that's not what we got. That wasn't what the prequels were. They weren't that dark. Although, Revenge of the Sith in that Order 66 sequence was heavily influenced by The Godfather. By the end of the first Godfather film, they hit on the 5 families. So maybe tonally, the prequels on a whole weren't living up to that expectation, but I think George did kind of come through with a little bit of that. But that's what I've loved about these last 2 episodes of Icons Unearthed. They've been fantastic.
Yeah, really good stuff. We got some highlights from that coming up too. Just to sort of, put all of that stuff to bed, all the Marcia Lucas stuff, all of that. As a matter of fact, if we want to just jump into voicemail, we have a voicemail from someone who talks a little bit about Icons and their take on the prequel era.
Let's do it.
You must contact me.
Play back the entire message.
What message?
Message after the message.
The Emperor commands you to make contact with him. It's a trick. Send no reply.
Hi, Jason and Jimmy. This is Matthew Rooney calling from Arkansas. I wanted to say something about the Icons Unearthed documentary that just wrapped up. Overall, I enjoyed it, but I feel like the last couple of episodes that dealt with the prequels didn't appreciate the movies for what they are. And the main takeaway seems to be that the prequels weren't as good as the original trilogy because, Marcia Lucas wasn't there to edit them and to sort of guide George. And also he had all these yes men, which is a trope we've heard since the films came out, I feel, around him, that were not telling him when he should change things or cut back on certain things. But I truly feel that they're 2 different trilogies. They give us 2 different things. Obviously, you can put forward that the original trilogy has a better quality to it, but I feel like the prequel trilogy, we really got a pure look at George's vision. I think it's a good thing that he was sort of unbridled during that time, that he was able to do whatever he wanted to and have that get on the screen. And obviously due to his development of the digital editing and the digital technology as well, with the digital cameras for the later 2 films. I think that is really the main takeaway for me from those films. What do you guys think about the way that the Icons Unearthed dealt with the prequel trilogy in its final 2 episodes? Thanks, guys.
I think that they handled it really well. If anything, I'd have liked to have seen a full 7 episodes of Icons Unearthed. I'd like to have seen each prequel get a dedicated episode like they did with, or more or less did with the original trilogy. I thought that, they did a good job, Jim, of sort of setting up the anticipation and then the immediate fallout from it, followed by the 20 years later and the impact that it had on kids that were, the age that you were and I was when the original films were coming out. And so I thought they did a good job. I will say, I think Matthew brings up a great point. This is unbridled George. That's what the prequels are. This is George unhinged. Famously, he says in that one behind the scenes piece, as he's in the editing bay or in the theater doing a screening, I may have gone too far, he says at one point. But I do sometimes wonder if the constraints and the limitations that he ran up against during the original trilogy weren't actually a help to him. So I wouldn't sit there and say, they made it cracked up to be, it would have been much better if Marcia Lucas had been there. I mean, she thinks so. Maybe there are some people that think so. Howard Kazanjian thinks that he comes out and says the prequels would have been better had I been there. He doesn't really explain why necessarily, nor does he ever give an example of what his creative input was on the films that he worked on. But all in all, I thought it was a pretty well-balanced look at the prequels, albeit short.
Well, I mean, if you think that the prequels are getting the raw end of the deal from this documentary, it's because of the fact that nobody who worked on the prequels is actually interviewed in this documentary. Everyone they talk to are original trilogy contributors. They're people who did not go on with George to work on the prequels. And so they have a very sort of, maybe they look at it as a little bitter pill to swallow, that they maybe felt like they should have been working on the prequels. We have some clips here from the show that sort of illustrate that point. But I just think that, a lot of documentaries are based on the material that is presented within the documentary.
Sure.
And who is presenting material within this documentary? It's people like Phil Tippett, Marcia Lucas, Howard Kazanjian, people who didn't work on the prequels at all and might have a little chip on their shoulder because of that.
They do have Anthony Daniels and Ian McDiarmid. They talk about the prequels, and those are newer interviews.
Okay. Yeah. And they do offer a different, Anthony
does. McDiarmid is straight down the line, man. I feel like he's like, hey, if there's something Star Wars and you need Palpatine, I'm there. I feel like he has no axe to grind. He knows what it means to him and his career and his bank account. Not saying that that's the only reason he does it, but he doesn't seem to have a chip on his shoulder at all. Anthony Daniels surprisingly letting some bitterness seep through in this whole documentary series that we haven't seen before.
Well, 3PO was really underused, very underused in the prequel trilogy.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And much more so than I would have ever imagined prior to it coming out. But,
and underused compared to even R2-D2, which is his buddy. It's like, just having Costello in an Abbott and, in a movie with Abbott and Costello. They broke up the duo.
Now, we've heard Anthony talk about Star Wars. I mean, he wrote a book about it. He's been interviewed countless numbers of times. But I'm really interested in some of the voices we don't often hear from that are presented in Icons. Marcia Lucas, Howard Kazanjian.
Yeah.
And then throw in Phil Tippett and Roger Christian. And this is a clip of Prequel Criticism from the final couple episodes of Icons.
After I saw the movie, I went out and I sat in my car and I cried because I was so sad.
He told me that his vision for the prequels were going to be much more like The Godfather and dark and moody and more cloak and dagger-ish. I'm like, oh, that could be really cool. Anyhow, didn't quite turn out that way.
I thought the movie was racist. I mean, there were Chinese men.
You think she suspects an attack?
There were, what was he supposed to be, Jewish, I think?
I'm a Toydarian. My trick's gonna work, gonna make all the money.
George was upset by the accusations, particularly of racism against him, because if George, anyone isn't racist, it's George.
There's a little bit of regret there. If I was there, I know the prequels would have been better. And I think part of that problem is that he had yes men around him.
Howard, am I wrong though, Jim? I mean, there were several episodes that featured Howard quite a bit, and I don't recall him ever volunteering that he made any creative feedback towards George that was accepted. As far as I know, he was just a better money guy than Gary Kurtz, and perhaps managed the crew a little better than Gary Kurtz.
Am I aware of any Howard Kazanjian contributions that he made creatively to Return of the Jedi?
Yes.
To the story? The answer to that is I am unaware of Howard making any sort of creative decisions regarding Return of the Jedi or the development of the story or anything like that. I'm pretty sure Lawrence Kasdan had a firm grasp on all of the story details, he and George working together. So I don't know. That
I
would
just don't know where that's coming.
Sure.
Where it's coming from with Howard, because being a money guy, they talk about McCallum's prowess at handling $1. They said he's a guy that could turn $1 into $2 in a production budget. So but as you say, like, we don't really know. Well, we know that George picked up his young indie crew, or as many of them as he could, and those are the folks that worked on the prequels. And he had offered, according to Kazanjian, he had offered him a producer role on Young Indie, but it would mean that he'd have to be in London for a year plus, and he didn't want to do that to his kids. At least that's his side of the story. So once he told George no on Young Indie, George seems like the kind of guy, he's not going to ask you more than once. You want to work on a project with me? Yes or no? No. Okay. All right. Then he moves on.
Yeah. Yeah. And then sometimes people can have their responses sort of interpreted to a different degree. Like Kazanjian says, no, I don't want to move my family. Lucas interprets that to mean that Howard has stepped back from filmmaking to focus on his family. And so that might remove Howard from the playing field altogether.
Sure.
George might even sit around going, boy, I sure wish Howard was available, but he's a family man now. So, some people think about things like, in extreme ways like that, or Howard just wasn't being specific about the wiggle room he might have.
If he turns you down on going and relocating to London, how's he going to feel about going to Australia a few years later to work on episode 1? So,
yeah. Well, episode 1 was all shot in London.
Oh, that's right.
Episode 2 and 3 was shot out in Australia.
But Marcia, with the racism thing, that really shocked me, because now I know a little bit of this could be revenge, but up to that moment, I really thought she still cared very deeply for George, that there was a lot of love, at least for their history that they shared together, and she was pretty kind to him in this documentary, up into the point that she calls him a racist. That I thought was below the belt. Roger Christian comes in and says, hey, anybody that knows George Lucas, they know he's the furthest thing from a racist.
Yeah, that was surprising that she played that card, because the media played that up. They really played that angle up, and it was unfortunate. But even more so unfortunate to hear George's ex echoing that. But she does talk a little bit about, I believe the next clip is, she talks about George selling the company and how that had an effect on her, much like when she saw the prequel for the first time. It gave her something else to cry about.
George always said to me, I will never, ever sell my company. I will never, ever put my company on the stock market. I'm a success. I made all this money. I will never, ever give up my company. And guess what? He sold it. That made me sad.
Well, she's shedding a lot of tears in these last few episodes.
I bet it did make her sad. Because remember last week, I kept saying that number 50 million. I was able to verify that was the payout George gave her upon reaching their divorce settlement. She had half of Lucasfilm. This is true, but George bought her out for 50 million. And that's how that went down. She accepted the payment and went on and bought a house in Hawaii and, remarried and everything. And she left George, $50 million in 1983. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. But Lucasfilm, George sold Lucasfilm for $4.05 million.
That 05 is very important.
That 0.05 is George making back the money he lost by buying out Marcia, her share of Lucasfilm.
Oh, you think so?
So he made that money back in the long run. That's exactly why that 0.05 is at the end of that $4 billion. And $4 billion, I mean, my God, But again, that's 30 years later. So still,
That'd be
Yikes,
funny.
That's a lot of money.
That would be funny if that's true. It would be a very George thing. But, he was offered, yeah. I mean,
I think it's him sending a message.
It very well could be.
That he made his money back and then some.
Yeah. He insisted that he get paid more than they paid for Marvel. So, and that was part of it. And then they said, well, but George, you don't have anything developed. And he's like, yeah, I do. He pulled out some receipts and some napkins, and he had some notes scribbled on. Those were his treatments for the next trilogy.
Oh, yeah, the treatments. yeah. Those did just pop out of nowhere.
They sure did.
Obviously, George started developing that as an effort to add value to Lucasfilm before it was sold. And it did add a little more value. But George wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He still wanted to run the story and develop the film his way. And
on
Disney
someone else's
no.
dime. I mean, wouldn't that be great?
Well, he put Kathleen Kennedy in there, and he thought she would have his back. And, she was between a rock and a hard place. And he just didn't. I think it was a little naive for his smart and forward thinking as George Lucas is. That was all just a little bit of naive. I don't know. It was like a passive aggressive chess game he was playing, and he lost.
Yeah. And he, unlike George, Kathleen Kennedy didn't have, $4.05 billion to fall back on. So George could take those risks. Kathleen still had a career she had to be concerned with.
Exactly. So she's sad that George sold the company, and she didn't get her big payout like he did, because she would have held on to her piece of the company, but George insisted buying her out.
Yeah.
So, she accepted the deal because there was some sort of notion that George could bankrupt the company to avoid having to pay her out. And with that threat being there, the attorneys for Marcia Lucas encouraged her to seek some sort of settlement with George.
Yeah. And George also had a history, at least with Pixar, or what became Pixar. And I also think with the edit droid that became Avid, George had a history of having divisions of his company that were not profitable, that were not making money. He was pumping money in, subsidizing it because he believed in the technology so much. Of course, they later did become very successful. But so at that time, that they're divorcing, he's probably is pumping a lot of money into some of these, wishful thinking projects or someday maybe projects. Pixar, the Edit Droid, maybe even ILM and Skywalker Sound. I don't know when those became profitable or if they were right away. So it wouldn't be out of the question that George could make the company look really destitute on paper, which is what he would likely have had to do.
Yeah. I don't know how all the mathematics work out with something like that. That's way outside of my pay scale, but that's how that went down and how Marcia got forced out. And as a result, it was hard on her because, sure, she wanted to leave George. She left George, and she wanted a change in her life without George Lucas. But that still doesn't erase all of her professional achievements and the career she had and the fact that she played an instrumental role in building Lucasfilm. So it was really hard. It was really hard when Lucasfilm history began to erase her contributions from their story. And she talks a little bit about how George now acts like she doesn't even exist.
This is painful. But when I left George, he was very unhappy. He was very hurt. And the way he dealt with my leaving him was to decide that I never existed. As far as I know, my daughter wasn't even supposed to mention my name in his house. He just was so resentful and so angry at me for leaving. And he just sort of, that's the way he had to deal with it. They wrote a book called The First 20 Years of Lucasfilm. I opened up the book and I looked at the index and it said Marcia Griffin Lucas, one page. Marcia Griffin Lucas was an assistant editor I married in 1969.
Did you ever call him or email him or send him a letter ever and just say, what are you doing? Like, I know you hate me, but
You know, I didn't, because it's been how many years now? 40 years? And our daughter got married, you know, when we went to her wedding. He never spoke to me at the wedding. He didn't want to have anything to do with me, ever. I don't think he's forgiven me leaving. I don't think he ever will. I won't ever be able to say goodbye to him.
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough scene to watch. Yeah, it's very real.
It is. It is. Yes. But she did already say goodbye to him. You know? And he seems very, you know, that's it.
He seems
Just
good
like
with it.
Howard Kazan.
Well,
Yeah.
no, what I glean from that is that, you know, if that marriage was completely on the fritz as far as both of them are concerned, I can't imagine anybody being, you know, like George was with Marcia. I think that the reason that George did take it so hard and had to literally pull an Anakin Skywalker, that name no longer has any meaning to me. They weren't allowed to mention her name in the house. He tried to erase her from existing. It's very Darth Vader, actually, is because he did probably love her. And maybe still does, or still did. I think it was just such a painful thing that the only way he could deal with it was just to make her his enemy and take any reference or of her in his life and burn it, throw it out. I mean, that's hardcore, man.
And we know how George is when it comes to revisionist history. How many different tales has he told about the making of Star Wars and how this was always supposed to be that way? And I had this all figured out. I took the middle part of the saga because the story was too big. So I took the middle part and made that into all of that stuff is just a bunch of smoke. It's all smoke. And, so, you know, we've all seen him shift like the wind when it comes to recapping some of the history of Star Wars. Well, I think that aspect is prevalent in other areas of his life as well. He's never been known as a people person. He's always been as kind of a, you know, almost sociopathic in the way he acts sometimes. So in a situation like this, when he feels like he's given it all to get over the finish line and make Return of the Jedi and then step back and focus on his family, he never got to achieve that goal because during the making of Return of the Jedi, his wife, by several accounts, had an affair with the guy who put the stained glass dome in the library at Skywalker Ranch. I mean, that's been corroborated by other people, too. We heard Richard Edlund say, Marcia says the affair never happened, but does acknowledge there was another man. Richard Edlund is on the record saying there was something going on there. I'm just reading a book from ILM's Bill Kimberlin, and he says that Marcia ran off with the guy who put the dome in the library at Skywalker Ranch. So she said ran off. And Marcia was married after George and then got a divorce in the early 90s. So was she married to Tom Rodriguez, the guy, the stained glass artist? All of this stuff, you know, it's all floating around out there. And here's Lucas. He just wants to come home, finish Return of the Jedi and focus in on his family life. And I'll be damned if George did just that. He came back, did Return of the Jedi, and did step back to, quite a degree. Sure, he was still working on Indiana Jones and stuff, but he did raise a family in that downtime.
Yeah,
and
he did.
Dated Linda Ronstadt.
But the question I have is, did she not go to George I'm not defending the affair or anything, but did she not go to George and say, I'm burnt out, I'm burnt to a crisp, I can't do this anymore? It doesn't sound like, she doesn't say, oh, he said to me, one more movie, honey. We just got to do this one more movie and then we can focus on our family. I wonder if he focused on the family after he became a single dad. And what would have happened had he not? It didn't sound, according to her recount, that he had any signs or was showing any signs of wanting to slow down. In fact, he was quite critical of her for not being apparently strong enough to keep going. So I don't know.
Well, that could be. She did marry Tom Rodriguez, by the way. They were married for 10 years, 83 to 93. So
hard to imagine
as soon as she left George,
that there was no affair if she ended up marrying the guy, but who knows?
Right. So
the evidence.
Two could play at the game of revisionist history, apparently. But,
well, she calls him the other man. Messy. She doesn't even say, like, I did have an affair with my ex-husband. We met there, and she doesn't even try to explain it at all. She just says it never happened. What's her? She makes a passing reference to the other man, and then you find out that other man was her second husband. Crazy. Crazy.
Yeah. So apparently she's not remarried since 93. So, she might be just, it is sad. It's really sad. And I hate, that this has gone down the way it has. And, it is, from the outside looking in, it's pretty messy. So, and heartbreaking. But Lucas apparently has completely moved on, and Howard Kazanjian puts a wrap on all of this by talking about how George's life has significantly changed since the 80s.
Is he still in love with her? I think deep down he is. But if you talk to him and you watch his movements, I hate to use this word, but I think he hates her. He has a new wife. I was at his wedding. She's wonderful. He has a whole new life. I've called up many times, and I don't get a return phone call.
Bummer. You got that wedding
was at the wedding.
And,
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah. He's a complicated guy, that George Lucas.
Yeah.
I think he has really high standards. If you're his friend, I think he has really high standards.
Yeah, I think loyalty goes a far way with him. And, and disloyalty gets your butt kicked through the door.
It's hard to imagine that anybody that was, you made a great point about the people that are in this documentary all seem to have a beginning, middle, and end of their relationship with George Lucas for the most part. So if Howard was on George's speed dial, I don't know that he'd be talking as frankly as he is in this documentary.
Right. Exactly. Sometimes there's a heavy price to be paid when you are a successful film mogul who is single-handedly financed just about every change to modern cinema over the last 4 decades. It's comes with a price.
For sure.
Rebel Force Radio.
You've already made that Star Wars reference.
Your source for the Force.
Star Wars parody.
All right, Star Wars and pop culture. We take a look at Star Wars references showing up in non-Star Wars entertainment that we love. Could be a movie, could be a TV show. What do we got this week, Jim? What loyal RFR listener sent this one in?
This comes from young Jason from Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Jason Swank, loyal RFR listener, and royal pain in the ass. He
Sometimes contributor.
This one in. This one comes from a young Jason who was watching a show called Only Murders in the Building. It's a very rare collaboration between Martin Short and Steve Martin. Those two never work together.
Never.
So this time they actually are. I have no idea what the show is about. This is from season 2, episode 4. I can't set it up because Jason sent me the clip. So you jump in anytime.
Oh, all right. Well, they just I don't want to give too much away because it's a murder mystery, but they're sneaking around sort of the in this apartment building where they live. There's this sort of hidden tunnel system where you can go and you can kind of peek in other people's apartment units, and they just saw a rather emotional scene between a father and son. The father played by Nathan Lane. So this is Martin Short's character Oliver describing what he saw.
What did you find out about Teddy?
Nothing, except I saw him weep. It was like watching Darth Vader take off his helmet. I'm in a total state of shock. I really am. And I've never wanted to hug my son more.
So, yeah.
So my question is this: the hug my son more, is that part of the Star Wars reference, or I don't understand the hug my son more?
Oh, that's not part of the reference, really. It felt weird if I would have just cut it off right at that moment. But no, that's not part of the reference. It's just he has a son and their relationship isn't great. So he sees this big emotional scene happen between a father and son. He equates it to Darth Vader taking off his helmet and, and dying. That's sort of the implication. And then, he's like, now I need to go run and hug my son.
Okay. Well, I didn't know if it was because of the father and son thing with Darth and Luke or what was going on there. But, that's a Star Wars reference from Only Murders in the Building. We have some other Star Wars and pop culture references you guys have been sending in. Be sure to keep sending them in the show at Rebel Force Radio. And we'll be doing a big pop culture segment in an upcoming show. But we got to do a Rogue One rewind coming up here with Gary Whitta in the Cantina.
Star Wars Cantina.
Where are you going, Master?
For a drink. Sorry about the mess. You will never find the more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
All right, as promised, we got him here in the Cantina once again on Rebel Force Radio, Mr. Gary Whitta. Gary, so nice to see you again. It's been a long time.
It has. We were just talking before the show about when I was last on. It's been a while. It was the, as you reminded me, when I had written a story for the very first Star Wars A Certain Point of View book, which would have been, let me think, that would have been 2017, because that was the 40th anniversary of the first movie. So it has been a while.
It has, and we haven't had a chance to talk to you since you penned the second story from the sequel book, the From a Certain Point of View for Empire Rogue 2. I'm going to assume that's about our buddy Zev Seneska.
That's right. People do always make jokes about, oh, when are we going to see Rogue 2? Rogue 2. It's like, okay, well, I'll give you Rogue 2, just not the Rogue 2 that you might expect. The nice thing about it was I actually was able to tie into the movie Rogue One in what I thought was kind of a cute way. If you're not familiar with A Certain Point of View books, they're actually really, really cool, and you should check them out. What they did was in 2017, for the 40th anniversary of the original Star Wars, they did a book called Star Wars From a Certain Point of View. It was 40 stories for 40 years, and each one was from the point of view of a kind of a background character in the Star Wars movies. They're kind of digging deeper into their backstory and their perspective. So like a great example would be like the barkeep, the bartender in the Mos Eisley Cantina. I think there was even one from the point of view of the trash compactor monster that pulls Luke under. So there was some really fun perspectives. And when they
becoming
came back
Dianoga,
right, the Dianoga. And when they came back to me to do Empire, I just remember like, oh, Rogue 2, yeah, because that's of course the call sign of the pilot, Zev Seneska, who finds Luke and Han out, in Hoth after they get lost. And I thought it would be kind of cool to do a story from his point of view. And obviously Rogue 2, ended up being kind of a joke. But the nice thing about it was they were kind of like retcon it in what I thought was kind of a cool way. The idea that the whole idea of there being a Rogue 2 and there being a Rogue Squadron was that that squadron was named in honor of Jyn Erso and the whole Rogue One team. Because they obviously had all sacrificed their lives to, capture the plans, and without them, there's no rebellion. And so that was, I guess, their way of it's kind of like retiring the jersey. They put it up in the rafters, and that whole squadron is kind of retroactively canonized as having been named in honor of Jyn and Cassian and that whole team.
You know, it's funny you bring up Rogue One because I just saw Rogue One in the theater this past weekend in IMAX. How
It's
cool
back.
is it that it's back and it made $1 million? And I'm sure a lot of that gets funneled to the Whitta estate. No.
It's funny. So somebody sent me a story on Twitter this morning saying, "Hey, look at this! Isn't this cool? Rogue One breaks IMAX premiere box office records, biggest IMAX premiere in history." And I said, "That's great. It'd be even nicer if I saw any money from that." But I don't know how much you know about how Hollywood financials work. But writers, screenwriters typically don't see any money from theatrical box office at all. We see a little bit of what they call ancillary. So like, DVD, Blu-ray, streaming. If you rent the movie on iTunes, if you see it on, TNT, if you rent it, if you watch it on Disney Plus, we get a teeny tiny little piece of that. But when it's originally in its theatrical run, and if it comes back as it just did, and it is currently back in theaters on IMAX, that's not something that writers participate in financially.
Did you think about hitting the theaters this weekend, or?
I would like to have gone. I'm so desperately busy with work right now. I barely have time to like run to the store and get groceries. I did speak to Gareth just yesterday. He actually took his whole family to go, and I think it was a treat for him and the whole family to go back and see it again. I said I wish I could have gone, because as much of a thrill as it is to see your name up in the blue letters, right? The iconic blue letters at the end of the movie. That to me is like the biggest. That's my favorite scene in the movie, is when my name comes up.
Nice.
It would have been even nicer to see it on an IMAX screen, even bigger than ever. But my understanding is it's still in theaters for a few more days. And if I had the time to go, I would love to. I just don't.
Well, you're super prolific right now. I mean, you have so much going on. Of course, the top of your list would have to be this really cool thing you're doing on your Twitch channel. You do so many cool things on your Twitch channel all the time. You have something cool and different and fresh. And this time around, it's Gundog, which is tell everybody about Gundog and how you're rolling it out, because I don't think I've ever heard of an author rolling out his novel the way you're rolling this one out in such a cool multimedia fashion.
Yeah, I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about it, actually, because unlike Rogue One or any other of the Star Wars projects that I've done, I don't have like a big kind of Disney multi-million-dollar marketing machine to help promote it. It's really just me, because it's my own little project. But the short version is I'm also a novelist. I wrote a fantasy novel back in 2015 called Abomination, which I really enjoyed writing, and I wanted to try and write something in that medium again. I really enjoyed writing my first novel. So for the second thing, I wrote this science fiction story called Gundog, which is kind of like it's kind of a mashup of like, it's alien invasion, it's post-apocalyptic, it's got a big giant mech, like a big kind of 60-foot kind of war machine thing. It's really, really cool. It's like a lot of my favorite sci-fi influences all kind of mashed up into one original story. And I wrote it as a novel, but because I finished it kind of at the height of the pandemic, and I was thinking about like how to get it published. Maybe I'll self-publish it. Maybe I'll just try and do this on my own just to see what happens. But I also thought, well, if I'm self-publishing the book, why not also try to self-produce the audio book? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but like audio is like a huge part of how people read books now. It's like practically a third of the market is people who, have books read to them, essentially via Audible, and books on tape have been around forever. But, audio books now, people listen to them on their iPod or whatever. And it's a huge deal. So I thought, would it be interesting to try and produce the audiobook version myself as well, so I would own and control all of it. I wouldn't have to worry about anyone taking it away from me.
How George Lucas of you.
I tried to Lucas it a little bit. That's right. And I thought, well, it's audio. How hard can it be? Well, it turns out it's actually really quite hard to make decent audio. But I had a good crack at it. I'm fortunate enough because I work in Hollywood. I know actors, I know composers and things like that. So I called up a good friend of mine, Shannon Woodward, who was on HBO's Westworld, and she's in The Last of Us, and very well-known actor, very talented. And she agreed to basically perform and narrate the whole thing, 9 hours of audio. We also got Troy Baker from The Last of Us and, BioShock and Uncharted, very well-known video game and animation voice actor is in it as well. And my friend Austin Wintory wrote a whole orchestral soundtrack for it. So we really went above and beyond and produced this very kind of high-end piece of audio. And we did it all with shoestring and duct tape during the pandemic, spent very little money, did it all at home on our laptops and our home, recording equipment. But it ended up sounding great. And when it was all done, I thought, well, what's an interesting way, to kind of put this out? I could do a podcast. And in fact, there is a podcast, which I'll tell you about. But I thought it would be interesting because I have an audience on Twitch, the game streaming platform, where now, there's musicians on there, there's people doing cooking shows, Twitch is a kind of a, it's all kinds of stuff, interesting stuff on Twitch. And I thought, well, would it be interesting to try and debut this as an audio project? I basically tell a story like old-fashioned radio and do it live on Twitch, almost like a listening party for each episode. So I chopped up the audiobook into these 9-hour-long episodes, and we started a few weeks ago with episode 1. And the idea is each episode I appear live on camera, much as I'm here with you now, introduce the episode, kind of masterpiece theater style, tonight's episode, and I'll kind of talk about it a little bit, and then we play the audio. And the audience in the live chat kind of gets to kind of react and experience it all together, kind of this communal listening experience. And at the end of each episode, I come back as the author and answer questions and kind of do like book club discussion, whatever you want to call it. And it's been really, really fun. Like, people have responded to the story. The response has been tremendous, but people are also responding to the idea of doing it in a different way. Like, people all kind of listening to it together, almost like kind of old fashioned radio, people all kind of listening together and reacting in real time. It's really, really cool. I also put the episodes up on my YouTube channel. And then the main part of it, I think, ultimately will be the podcast edition, which you can subscribe to right now. You can type Gundog into any podcast, provider you might have, and it'll show up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever podcast provider you might use. There should be some episodes there by now. I parked it a little bit because what happened was, after I announced it, I got approached by one of these big kind of podcast networks and said, hey, why are you doing this on your own when we can distribute it for you and put you in front of a much larger audience and promote it with our other shows and like make a big deal out of it. So we're working on that right now. And that's led to a little bit of a delay of the podcast version as we, kind of work on it behind the scenes. But I think probably within the next week or two, that'll all be done and episodes will start dropping into the podcast feed. But like I said, if you want to get in on it now, you can subscribe to the podcast. Again, it's GUNDOG in any podcast engine you might have. You'll find it there. There's a 7-minute prologue that you can listen to right now. And then when episode 1 drops, it'll come directly into your feed. So that's how the Twitch version is very cool, but you have to be there live to. It's funny, we're kind of asking people to do what no one does anymore, which is like show up to listen to, like at, like who watches 7 p.m. Wednesday, you got to be there. Like I'm old enough to remember like racing home in my car to like catch the West Wing before it started. Sure. TiVo or DVR. And of course, no one does that now. Now you just watch shows on your own schedule. You binge them. You watch them when you feel like it. So the Twitch version has been cool as like as appointment viewing, I guess. Like people kind of listen to it together. But the lion's share audience for it will be on the podcast, the way that people in your car or while you're doing the laundry or whatever, like people listen to podcasts that way. And so I'm really excited for the podcast launch. I think that's going to be really, really cool. I'm excited for people to hear the story. I'm very proud of it.
Well, congrats, man. That sounds great. And so it's Gundog. Yeah. And you can catch it in so many different ways. I like your live Twitch on Wednesday night, though, because that's an event, right?
We literally call it a live serialized sci-fi audio event. And that's kind of, again, almost getting back to the idea of the funny thing is in the internet age, everything that's old is new again, right? It's like when narrative podcasts have become a big deal recently, right? That's a very big emerging space, and like big Hollywood stars are getting in on it. It's like, oh, what a concept, like it's fiction, but it's audio, and you listen to it, and it's like, yeah, we had that in the 1930s. It was called radio, But now you listen to it on your phone instead of a radio. But that is kind of the old fashioned concept that the live version was meant to kind of get back to. It's almost again like long before we were born, but the idea of like everyone kind of would huddle around the radio, to listen to the Shadow or Gunsmoke or whatever. The cinema experience, right? We just about Rogue One being back in theaters. Part of watching a movie together is like everyone gasps or cheers at the same moment. You feel like you're experiencing something together. And Gundog in the live iteration is a little bit like that, in the sense that when, the live chat is always happening off to the side. So when I kill off a character or whatever, a big plot twist happens, everyone goes, oh my God, they all kind of get to react together and have that sense of kind of experiencing something together. So yeah, that's been, and for me as a writer, who lives on feedback, it's really fun to see that happening. Like I've reduced the feedback window to 0 because I'm seeing it happen in real time as the story is being narrated by Shannon. So that's been, as I'm sitting there kind of listening to everyone else and watching the chat, that's been really a fun experience for me as a writer to see how people are experiencing it in real time.
Not many storytellers have that opportunity, as you say, to narrow that.
But that's the beauty of the internet age and these streaming platforms where you can present something to an audience in real time. And so I'm surprised more people, I'm surprised that this is the first time that it's been done. Like, it is kind of a cool idea. I guess I'll give myself credit for that. It's the first time that, you know, an original literary work from a somewhat well-known, you know, writer has been essentially published in this way on a social media platform, on a streaming platform like Twitch. And again, I've also put it on my YouTube channel. You can listen to the episodes there, and of course as a podcast. And then when the whole thing is done, the actual book that you can read, you know, once the audio version is done, I'll publish the actual book, because like I like to read, but funny thing is I did an audio book, but I personally don't like to listen to audiobooks. I would much rather sit and read. And so for people who might be thinking, hey, this story sounds pretty cool, I'm just not really into audiobooks, well, the actual book will come out at the conclusion of the audio series. So there's, hopefully, whichever way you want to consume it, there's some way for you to
truly
get it.
Multimedia, you know, which is again very Star Warsy actually when you think about it.
The serialized version, does that contain the exact same content as the novel, or are there any differences between the two?
That was actually a really interesting kind of thing to discover, is that when I first wrote the book, I wasn't thinking about audio. I just wrote it to be read off the page. And then when Shannon started recording it, what I realized was not that often, but every now and again, there was a sentence that sounded better in your head when you were reading it than when it's read aloud. And so every now and again, when I would get Shannon's audio back, it's like, you know what, that sentence, as it turns out, is a bit of a, like, for example, like some sentences that read fine on the page because you get to read at your own pace, or it's a bit of a tongue twister for Shannon to actually deliver the line. And so every now and again, I would go back and just retool a line. So if you were to take the audio script and the manuscript of the book and compare them, I would say they're like 99.5% the same. But every now and again, there's a line that was retooled just to kind of make it better suited to be read aloud for audio.
Yeah, that makes me think about behind the scenes shooting the original Star Wars. Harrison Ford would occasionally run into some clunky George Lucas dialogue on the page, and he'd say, "George, you can read this, but you can't say it." And
It's true. It's very true. Stuff often sounds better on the page than it does read aloud. That's why when I'm writing a script, I often, you know, I try to imagine the writers saying it. That was actually one of the most sobering moments I had as a writer. Very early in my career, I wrote a script, the first script that I ever sold. At one point, Kurt Russell was attached to play the lead, and I actually got to go to Kurt Russell's house and sit with him and talk about the script, and it was a really cool experience. Goldie Hawn brought us cookies. It was mad. It was so because I didn't even put it, for some reason, I mean I knew they were married, right, but I didn't put it together. I'm sitting in Kurt Russell's living room, and this very nice lady comes in and says, "Oh, would you boys like some cookies?" And I look up and it's Goldie Hawn. I'm like, what is my career? Like, this is insane. So that was very cool. But the sobering part of it was Kurt was like, I really like the script, but like there's some dialogue that we're going to need to change. I was like, okay, well, let's get into it. And Kurt's, you know, he was a child star, right? He's been in Hollywood all his life. Like, he's been you know, reading dialogue off the page for 50 years and trying to make it work. And I remember he said, I'll give you one example. Here's like a passage of dialogue that you've written. I am going to read this now. I'm not going to try and phone it in or mess it up for the sake of like make it. I'm going to read this as best. I'm going to like use all of my acting skills to make this line, deliver this line as best I can. And he did it, and it did not sound good. I'm like, oh wow, now I get it. Okay, so we're going to have to redo that line. And so that's been a similar experience as when you're writing a novel like that. Once it's written, that is then conveyed directly to the reader. It goes right into their brain, right, as they're reading it. But when you're writing dialogue for, you know, whether it be an audio podcast or a Star Wars movie or whatever it might be, that has to go through the conduit of an actor who has to deliver it and sell it. And you're right. I mean, I've heard those stories where you want, you know, faster, more intense. Like we've all heard the Star Wars stories, that some of that dialogue is kind of clunky. And that is one of the gifts of a great actor, is they can actually sell really clunky dialogue.
You know what would be a lot of fun is to take somehow, if we could, every iteration of the Rogue One script from when you started working on it all the way through to the final edit that we see on screen, and somehow we can mash it up and make an audio drama of the entire story with everything that ended up on the cutting room floor, somehow rethink it to make all the scenes fit together and have the ultimate Rogue One story being told, because we know so much of Rogue One changed after the story left your hands.
So, okay, so there's a couple of points about that. You raise a really interesting point for a couple of reasons. First of all, what's interesting about that is, of course, that idea is not unprecedented in Star Wars, right? They went all the way back to the Adventures of Luke Starkiller and turned that into a big comic book, right? They took George's original draft, which again was vastly different from the film that he ended up making. That also went like this again. It's steeped in Star Wars tradition for scripts to go through like major changes and major evolution of story from the very first iteration to the version you see. I've got a copy of it here. The Lucasfilm gave me a copy when I started it. It was like The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, and it's vastly different to the movie that was made. In terms of Rogue One, though, I mean, you're right. Also, again, lots of iterations, lots of writers came and went. The script evolved in many ways. But I would argue that the ultimate version of Rogue One is pretty much what you saw. I think that all the development was for the best. There was a lot of stuff in my script that I'm glad, we moved past because it wasn't the best version of the movie. There's a couple of little things left over from my version of the script where I'm like, I kind of wish they'd have kept that. I feel like that was, I would have done that slightly. There's a couple of moments in the final film where I'm like, I would have done that slightly differently, but they're few and far between. For the most part, I'm like, yeah, like you can see, like people always think that like development, reshoots, things like that are the signs of a troubled production. And I remember all the headlines at the time, but I'll give you one example. Let me ask you this question. What do you think is what would you say is most people's favorite scene from Rogue One?
The Vader.
In the hallway?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a reshoot done at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes to show that sometimes, whether it's reshooting, whether it's rewriting, whether it's, in the edit room, again, we've all heard this. We all know the stories of, how much, Marcia Lucas played, the influence that she played in editing the original movie and kind of, making stuff that wasn't working, taking stuff that wasn't working and making it work. That process never, from the very first kind of story meeting all the way up to locking the final cut, you're always asking the question, can we make this better? Can we make this better? Until the very last minute. And Rogue One's a perfect example. I said, I remember Gareth telling me the story. He was sitting in the edit bay reviewing footage. Like the film was shot. And he was sitting in the edit bay with Jabs, one of the editors, and Jabs said to him, I feel like we need something here. I feel like there's an extra thing that we could add. And that's where Vader in the Hall, and they went back and they built that set and they went back and shot it. And like I said, many people's favorite scene.
Gary, did you know when you were working on Rogue One that a character like Darth Vader was yours to utilize? Like what was off limits at the time that you were involved in the film?
They didn't have any hard and fast rules. They just gave us there was a general sentiment of encouraging us to expand the universe and not just, kind of fall into the trap of fan service and let's see this character and let's see that character. In Lucasfilm, I've heard it called the small universe problem, where it's the same 8 characters that keep bumping into each other, right? Because there's this tremendous desire to like, I want to see Boba Fett. I want to see Obi-Wan Kenobi. I want to see Han Solo. But you know what? There's more than 3 people in this galaxy. There's lots and lots and lots of people. And I feel like, now that they're telling so many stories in television, the opportunities are presenting themselves to broaden the net. And it doesn't always have to be the same few characters. And so the general, again, it was just a guideline. There was never any hard and fast rules, but it was like, let's see new characters. This doesn't have to be like the saga films. And of course, from a story point of view, it can't be the same characters, right? They have their own part in the story. It's not like, we're going to see Luke Skywalker and Han Solo stealing the Death Star plans. We know that they don't come into the story until afterwards. And so we did have to come up with a whole new crew of characters that could populate this movie. But I do remember Gareth and I saying, like, that's great. And we want to do original characters and we want to grow the universe. And it's cool to create new Star Wars characters rather than just write ones that already exist. But there was also a sense like there's got to be something like this. There's got to be something iconic that people can like, given that this is all totally new. And at the time, we didn't know if the idea of a standalone movie would work. It's something different from the saga films. Like that has something that has to be communicated to the audience. This is not Luke Skywalker. It's something else. It was like, what is the connective tissue that we can have that feel like some familiar elements that'll make people understand right away, oh, this is Star Wars, even though I don't recognize most of these characters. And that's where the idea of, so Vader and Tarkin were the 2 that made the most sense to us, because look, it's the Death Star, right? And this movie takes place literally like the day before A New Hope. Sure. And we know that Tarkin and Vader are on the Death Star. We know that, Tarkin is, played a big part in, in constructing it, and it's newly built. And so it would almost seem weird to not have them there. So why are they suddenly showing up now? Like, it made sense for them to be in the continuity. And so Vader, we always knew we wanted to have him, but not, again, don't overuse it, which is why he's only in a couple of scenes. He's so iconic, you don't want to overdo it. I feel like less is more with a character like Vader. And then again, with Tarkin, it was, again, like, he's so clearly, like, he didn't just show up yesterday, like, he's been there a while on the Death Star. So let's make sure that he's there as well. Then, of course, there was the whole question of, well, how are we going to do that? Peter Cushing.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you that as well, because as you were writing, did you have to concern yourself with the possibilities and, as far as what it might take to, bring a character like Tarkin back to life? Or were you just sort of, unchained from all of those constraints and parameters, and you're just like dreaming big, and this is what I would like to see in an ultimate story before A New Hope?
So it really was an evolution from one to the other for me, and it happened very quickly. And one of the luxuries of working on a movie that is going into production, I wrote the movie at the Lucasfilm offices, in an office, and Gareth was next door to me, and right across the hall from me is the ILM art department. And that was the amazing thing about making the movie, is I would write a scene and we would go across the hallway the next day and it's like all beautifully painted. Oh my God. Oh, that's what Vader's castle looks like. I just wrote that yesterday. That's amazing. And so it's this incredible kind of creative feedback loop that you get into as they're bringing their ideas to you, bringing them to life in real time. With Tarkin, I was nervous because, like, well, how can you do this? Like, Peter Cushing is gone. And so what are we going to do? Like, do you find an actor that looks like him? Our audience is going to accept that. I don't know. I just knew from a storytelling perspective he needed to be in the movie. It would seem like he's missing without it. And of course, my co-writer of the story is John Knoll, who is also one of the leading lights at ILM. And so we got to have these conversations that talks about both. Like, these are the needs of the story, and this is how we would realize it through the magic of ILM. And of course, John has got one foot in both worlds. So it was really easy to have that conversation with him. And again, I didn't give ILM enough credit because I would say, I feel like Tarkin, we should put him in the movie, but like, how do we do that? And I remember John saying, don't worry about that. Write him into the movie the way you think he should be, and we will solve that problem. That's what we do here at ILM. I was like, this has never been done before. And he's like, that's what we do here at ILM. And so I wrote it. I still didn't 100% buy into it because when I first wrote him in the movie, I wrote it. He's in my version of the movie, but like in fewer scenes. And it was like they were short scenes. And I would always write, he's like kind of like in shadow. It's like, I'm trying to give ILM like a lot of margin for error here. And they were, and then of course, when I was on set and I saw some of the dailies, and they've got the actor who plays Tarkin, I can't remember, Guy something, a tremendous actor.
Guy Henry,
Guy Henry, and he played him as a full lights motion capture rig, like he's the main only character on the scene. I was like, oh, you guys are going for it. And this incredible performance capture, and Guy Henry was able to just that voice. I mean, he sounds just like him. And then of course they digitally, recreated Peter Cushing over Guy's performance, and that's how they created him. And I still remember watching the movie with an audience for the first time. They almost dare you to believe they haven't done it. Like when you first see Tarkin, it's from behind, and he's like peering out and looking at the Death Star from the Star Destroyer bridge, and you just see the back of his head. And I feel like the movie's making you think, yeah, I get that's Tarkin, but you're only going to see the back of his head because how are they going to do it? But then he turns around, and I heard everyone in the audience go, it's like they actually did it. And so that I thought was really cool.
They did it, and they keep coming back and doing it over and over. And all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, I'm watching Peter Cushing's latest movie.
Right. And then of course, then they did it again with Leia at the end.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So my understanding of that was that they showed that to Carrie, and she didn't believe it. Her reaction, again, I wasn't in the room, but I was told this secondhand, but it was like Carrie said, where did you find that footage of me? And they were like, no, that's digital. And she was like, oh my God, like she almost couldn't believe what they had done.
Wow.
Yeah. My wife elbowed me when Tarkin showed up on screen and said, oh, they brought him back for this. I'm like, yeah,
right.
You don't know the lengths they had to go through to bring him back.
I saw reviews that thought we used a lookalike. I saw reviews that didn't think the CG looked convincing. I mean, I've heard every version. I've saw people that were convinced that was Peter Cushing, and then again we had pulled footage, unused footage from A New Hope, which we did do in other places, but we didn't. I don't believe we used any Peter. They had a lot of reference for Tarkin, and for Peter Cushing's like kind of 3D facial map that they had reconstructed. Everyone seemed to think it was done in a different way.
Gary, how does it make you feel, now that we're, 10 years into the Lucasfilm Disney era, and I'm sure you hear this a lot. We hear it a lot here at Rebel Force Radio, that after all this time and all of this great, entertainment that's come out between these two powerhouses, that a lot of fans, more than a few, continue to say that Rogue One is still the peak of the post George Lucas era of Star Wars. How does that make you feel?
So the first thing I would say in response to that is, like, I always temper the degree to which I allow myself to kind of feel flattered or proud of that, because, I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm just one very small piece of that movie. And indeed, just one small piece of even the writing of that movie. There were 3 other writers on the film. There were some uncredited writers. There's a lot of different people helped tell that story. Just the writing of it. And so, I was John, as kind of wrote a very rough early version of the story. I developed it into a full story and then wrote the first version of the screenplay. And then Chris Weitz, of course, came after me. We ended up becoming good friends. It's like a relay race. I always use it like a relay race. Like you run with the baton until you're exhausted, and then you hand it off to someone else and they run the next lap, and eventually you kind of get it done. But a big movie like that, it's almost unheard of for them to be written by just one person in these days. They tend to kind of want to bring a lot of writers on to make sure, again, it's like,
notice that a lot in the last several years.
It's not uncommon. And so when people say, anytime on Twitter, people say, "Oh, thanks for writing that movie," or "It's my favorite," I'll always say co-wrote, don't forget. And, there are obviously there are lots of parts of it that I can point to and go, "Yep, that's me. I came up with that. Oh, I wrote that bit." But there's also lots of other things, like when someone says, "Oh, I love Chirrut and Baze," I always say, well, you should thank Chris Weitz because he created those characters. And so, it's all kind of divvied up. Having said that, though, having played even a small part in something that, is now part of, it's such a larger whole, like to be a part of the Star Wars canon, and to kind of lay a brick in that foundation and see it now reflected in other things. Like, I see Saw Gerrera show up in video games. It's, the things that we established in that movie now continue to go forward and influence, the next generation of Star Wars creators. And that's amazing. And again, the Blue Letters thing comes from when we first saw the premiere, when the credits were rolling. Chris Weitz nudged me and said, "We're in the Blue Letters." And I was just thinking, like, that's the best thing ever. Like, the 10-year-old version of me who was like playing with my, kind of Star Wars action figures could never have imagined that would happen. And so it's been brilliant. And I mean, particularly with Rogue One and this new era of films, and every now and again, I don't know how it happens, but every now and again, Rogue One like blows up on Twitter again. It trends like reliably every 2 or 3 times a year. Right now, of course, obviously because it's back in theaters, but sometimes someone just posts a tweet like, "Oh, here's a random Rogue One appreciation post," or whatever, and it gets retweeted and it just organically kind of bubbles up again. And I know that there have been polls, some of the IGN, and I know some other big media outlets have done polls like, "What's your favorite Star Wars movie?" or more strictly, like, "What's your favorite movie of kind of the new Disney era?" And of the Disney era, and again, I'm not trying to brag, this is just a fact, Rogue One is always number 1 by like a mile. And so given that, the Disney era movies have been, I think most people would say, a bit of a mixed bag, there's a little bit of everything in there. The fact that we came out on the right side of that equation, especially considering how nervous we were going in, like, I mean, the 7, 8, 9, the prequel trilogy obviously had its own set of pressures in, like, you got to continue the story, but we were writing, even though it was a standalone, we were writing a story that was like directly adjacent to the original film, like the one that started it all. And that was really nerve-wracking to me. It's like, what if it's so bad that it like blights the original film? I'd be like, I can't watch Star Wars anymore. Rogue One ruined it for me. That's the nightmare scenario. In fact, the opposite happened, where I've heard people tell me that this is the best compliment we've ever got on Rogue One, is that people tell me that now they think it makes the original movie better, because all the context and everything that happened to like get the Death Star plans. It's like, oh my God, all these people died on Scarif, and now this stupid kid on a farm's got those plans and doesn't know what to do with them. Like, it just, and I've seen people even have kind of like have edited, they've kind of stitched the two movies together.
Yes.
And kind of created connective tissue in the edit so that like you can watch the whole contiguous thing. So it's brilliant. And like I said, I was only a very small part of it, but what an amazing thing to be a small part of.
And of course, its popularity has been so solid that it's now spawning a spinoff in the Andor series. What are we looking forward to seeing in that? And were you brought in any way, shape, or form to consult or work on this series?
No, I wish I could tell you. I heard about it when you did. I'll see it when you did. There are plenty of people out there that are, in the press who have seen it. I certainly haven't. When it arrives on Disney Plus, that is when I will have the opportunity to see it. I didn't come back. Gareth didn't come back. Chris Weitz didn't come back. So it is, it's a continuation, obviously, of the Rogue One universe, of that little chunk of the timeline. I got to do my own little bit of that because after I was done on Rogue One, as I'm sure you know, I wrote several episodes of Star Wars Rebels, and that had some Rogue One. Rebels and Andor, as best as I understand it, is like not that far apart in terms of the chronology. Right? It's all like immediately pre Rogue One. I'm sorry. Rogue One and A New Hope. And so I wrote an episode of season 4 of Rebels where Forrest Whitaker came back as Saw Gerrera, and we got to kind of write that character knowing how he'd already been established in the movie. And in fact, some of the stuff that I really wanted to put in Rogue One, I ended up finding ways to sneak it into Rebels instead, and we told the story through the animated show instead. So I think it's great. I have no idea what to expect from that show. Like I said, I'll see it when you all do.
As someone who has written a screenplay for a Star Wars film, what would it have been like for you, like with the when they decided, well, let's take this Kenobi feature. It's a 2-hour film, and let's make it 6 hours and make it season 1 of perhaps a multi-season. Is that something that you would have enjoyed when you were working on Rogue One, if they'd have knocked on your door and said, yeah, this 2-hour movie, we're going to make it into a TV series? What advantages are there, and then what disadvantages are there as a writer?
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things I often think about when I develop original material these days is like, what is it? Is it a TV or is it a movie? Because we've gotten to the point now where the two mediums are kind of in parity, right? Like this, we have, back in the day, we didn't have such a thing as prestige TV. Now we have it, right? We have like, Game of Thrones or The Mandalorian, all these kind of amazing high-end TV shows that have the same production values and are as well written as anything, you would see in movies. Like TV used to kind of feel like cinema's, kind of like poorer brother. Not anymore, right? Some of the best storytelling is on television now. And so it's really a question of like, do I need 2 hours to tell this story, or do I need 10? Would this work better episodically, or all in one chunk? And every story has its own creative answers to that question. I thought Rogue One worked very well as a 2-hour film. Had I been brought in to write it as, let's say that Rogue One never existed, but it now came up as an idea as like a Disney Plus TV show, and now you got to tell the story of the Death Star plans over 10 hours. I'm sure there would have been a great way to. I have never given it any thought until right now when you asked me the question. I'm sure there's a great way to tell that story as well. But at the time, of course, we were, Lucasfilm was primarily focused on film. Now it's more television, but at the time it was, film. And that's, to me, the TV stuff is great. But I personally always for me, Star Wars is cinema, right? Star Wars is big screen movie making. The fanfare. And I think to some extent, even with the biggest TV you've got in your house, you can only recreate that to some movies. Some stories really do demand, a big screen and that whole kind of theatrical experience. IMAX, that whole thing, can transport into another world. So I think it could have worked equally well in either format. And I think it's really interesting to see, back in 2014, when we were working on Rogue One, the TV landscape, there was no Disney Plus, right? Netflix wasn't what it is today. And so just in the last few years, since Rogue One has come out, that landscape has shifted massively. If someone had the idea for Rogue One today, it would more likely be developed for television because that's just commercially where the market is right now.
Most definitely. And remind us of the character of Andor and where he originated. Did he show up in your screenplay, that character?
That's a combination of me and Chris, but mostly Chris. Jin always had a rebel, not sidekick, but they were partners essentially on the mission. And he worked for the rebellion and was kind of like a. He was like a spy intelligence background. So there were some elements of Cassian in the earlier version of the character. But when Chris came on, he pushed him much more towards the version of the character that you see in the movie now. And then after Chris left and, subsequent writers came on, like he developed more and more. So I would say it's like probably, I think casting is like 80%. You can't really do the math on stuff like this, but like, I don't know, 20% me. I would say like 70% Chris, and then 30% like whoever else, helped bring it over the finish line. So it's K2SO went through a similar evolution, and Krennic, like all of these characters, the fundamentals don't change, but the way the expression evolves a lot through all the drafts of the script.
It was funny you mentioned how excited people were to see Tarkin in Rogue One. I've seen a lot of chatter online. People are excited at the possibility of seeing Krennic in Andor. So you kind of help create your own Tarkin, or it's established.
Who knows? The one thing that I've heard, and again, I've not been following it very closely, but the one thing I heard the other day was they said like no fan service. So I think if people are looking for like, oh, there's Krennic, or oh, there's Tarkin, or oh, there's a character I recognize from Star Wars, I'm getting the sense that the people making it just aren't interested in that. So I don't know how like the hardcore fan base are going to feel like that, because to me, part of it's not the point of doing it, and I think you do have to like the fan service. You have to kind of understand that like a little goes a long way. It can't all be about that. But part of the fun of the Marvel movies, and to a lesser extent, I think the Star Wars movies, going, oh look, that's that. Even like Rogue One's a great example. A lot of Star Wars Easter eggs. Like, it's funny. I'll tell you a story. When we did the premiere, they always have like the 501st, the Rebel Legion, and Mandalorian mercs, the real fans, the cosplayers. They invite a bunch of them to the premiere, so there's great pictures on the red carpet, but they also come in to see the film, and they sit way in back. Like the last like 5 rows in the back are all the cosplayers and all the hardcore fans, and all the movie executives and producers, of course, have the best seats in front. And what's funny is, because by this point you're like, the movie backwards and front, so you're more kind of like listening to the audience react to the movie than you are the movie. Like, what the movie is, you just don't know how the audience is going to react, and so you're listening. And anytime there was a really obvious Easter egg, like for example, Vader's the biggest one. As soon as Vader shows up, everyone goes, because like who doesn't know who Darth Vader is, right? But then there's all these different levels, because there are different levels of Easter eggs. When I'm going to forget the name of the guy, but We're Wanted Men, that guy, and Warriors guy's his buddy,
Dr. Evazan and
Dr.
Ponda
Evazan
Baba,
and Ponda Baba. So he shows up in Rogue One, right? And that's a deeper cut. Like, not everyone recognizes him, but if you've seen Star Wars more than a couple of times, you probably go, oh, that's the guy from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and you hear a little ripple, but less so, because it's not as recognizable as Darth Vader. And then the really, really deep cuts show up, and funnily enough, they're all from Rebels. You see when you see the ghost on the landing pad at Yavin, right? When you hear the radio guys say, General Syndulla reports a blah, 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 or this is the biggest one, is when Chopper rolls by. It's a 2-second shot, like hidden in the back of the scene, but you hear all the guys at the back go, woohoo, like they all recognize every little Easter egg, no matter how granular it is. Like Chopper's in that movie for like 2 seconds, and it's blinking, you'll miss it, and you really, I have to point, like, there he is in the back. You better believe those Star Wars fans saw him.
Some of us older fans were yelling and screaming for red leader, gold leader.
Oh, yeah.
That being a big thrill.
Let me tell you something. My favorite things to write sometimes were the things that didn't even need to be written, but which have to be part of the movie, right? Because we know there's going to be a big rebel X-Wing attack. So I have such a funny, I have a sense memory of this that is like, I still get a chill thinking about it. Like, I didn't come up with anything. There's nothing clever or creative on my part about it. It's just something I got to do. I got to sit and write red leader standing by, gold leader standing by, Locust falls in attack position. And it was just like, I just got to write that, like, for a new Star Wars film. Like, it was just, that was a really giddy thrill.
You got to type it out.
I got to type it out.
Well, you're such an established, your fandom has been so established as an original generation Star Wars fan. So we'd like to wrap up our interview with something we do for our guests. It's a questionnaire of Star Wars questions that might appear to be very simple on the surface, but can provide some of the most complex answers. These questions
this is not like a trivia quiz, is it?
Oh no,
no, sir, no.
Okay.
This is
because I'm not as good at Star Wars trivia as you might think.
Anyone can do a trivia quiz. This is for real fans.
This is more soul searching. Okay.
Yes.
All right, I'm up for
Definite
it.
soul searching here. And
Okay.
these are questions that were compiled by Yoda during his exile on Dagobah. He had nothing else to do.
Okay. All right. Are you going to
provide
read them
some
like Yoda?
content for a podcast. No, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. We do have an opening intro, though, created by Lounge Lizard Richard Cheese.
The Yoda Questionnaire.
There it is.
Wow, is that the actual Richard Cheese? You got to do that?
That is Richard, yes.
It's amazing. Very impressed.
All right. Gary Whitta, keep in mind, there are no wrong answers. There are some that are more right than others, but there are no wrong answers. So we'll start off with number one. Who or what, because we want to be inclusive here, is your favorite Star Wars character? Who or what?
Admiral Akbar. I don't know why. I've just always loved that character. He was originally written into Rogue One, and we replaced him. It turned out it was like, I remember the day they came in and said JJ's using him in Episode 7. So let's not do Akbar back to back. And so that's how Admiral Raddus was created. But that part was originally written for Admiral Akbar. I've always had a soft spot for Akbar. I love them on Calamari. I think they're super cool.
Excellent. And you are the very first who has ever dropped Admiral Akbar as your favorite Star Wars character. All right.
This is the first time I ever heard he was actually considered for Rogue One as well.
All right. We're going to venture over to the dark side now. Who or what is your least favorite Star Wars character? This is the one that you just, every time they come on screen or across the page, just get me out of here.
I mean, I guess it's a really lazy and obvious thing to say Jar Jar, but I really genuinely don't like that character. And I think there are lots of legitimate reasons why not. I remember one of the things when we were first working on Rogue One, John, who really is a student of Star Wars and the history and the production of it, and he had a whole thesis and a presentation of like humor in Star Wars. We all know that humor is really important to the Star Wars universe, right? Like they're not comedies, but without humor, they wouldn't be the same films. And some of our favorite moments are humorous moments, right? And John had this little presentation of various clips from movies across, at the time, it was all 6 films, of when humor works in Star Wars and why, and when it doesn't work and why. And the very simple conclusion that he had was anytime humor comes from character and tells you something about character, it's funny. And the example he gave is a very subtle example. It's not a big laugh. It's just a cute little character moment, is when Han Solo and C-3PO first meet in A New Hope. And he says, "Hello, sir." And Han Solo just kind of rolls his eyes like, who's this fucking guy? Like that's a really understated moment, but it always gets a laugh because it tells you something, right? And that dynamic that's established in the first 2 seconds of the meeting is the dynamic that plays out across the whole rest of their relationship.
Some of the funniest moments, I think, in all of Star Wars is the stuff between Han and 3PO and Empire Strikes Back. Because it is very subtle, and it tells you everything you need to know about those two characters. It's so well done.
Exactly right. And that's why, and again, humor that comes from character. And then John's second part was, here's where humor doesn't work. It's when it comes from slapstick. And he gave some examples. I can't remember, he gave a couple of examples from the original trilogy where he felt that humor didn't work because it was too slapsticky. And then of course, like the classic example from the Phantom Menace is like Jar Jar's kind of slipping around in the shit, and taking pratfalls and stuff. And that's again part of the reason, bringing it back around. Part of the reason why I don't like Jar Jar is so much of the humor is slapstick humor, and that's just not my. I don't find it very funny.
Yeah. It's a little. It's kind of talking down to the audience, I think, a little bit, and even as kids, there's ways to be humorous with kids without kind of just playing the lowest common denominator. He is not an unpopular answer to that question. I know.
I wish I'd have come up with something like so. I thought my Akbar, like you said, that was unexpected, but like Jar Jar's the most obvious. I'm trying to think of like what would a more. Let me see if I can come up with something by the end if I've got a better answer than Jar Jar. But Jar Jar's my fallback.
As a writer, I love asking these questions. We skip it sometimes for folks who aren't writers, but this is a great opportunity. What is your favorite Star Wars line? There's a lot of classic, iconic lines of dialogue, but what is your favorite?
You know what? I got a good one for you because it's not going to be an obvious one. It's a line and a moment. It's one of I personally think that Return of the Jedi is a very underrated film. I know it gets a lot of hate, mostly because of the Ewoks, but I think it's terrific. There's so much to like about that film. And so much of the Battle of Scarif at the end of the Rogue One is so heavily influenced by the Battle of Endor. Then you can kind of see where the obvious parallels are. It's beautifully put together. I think it's such a great culmination of the story. All the loose ends are wrapped up. It's so emotional by the end. When I was 11 years old, I was crying at the end of Return of the Jedi in the movie theater. And the best space battle ever put on film, still to this day. I love all the stuff on Tatooine, the sail barge, the Rancor, all that stuff is terrific. And it's just the Endor, the speeder bike chase is incredible. Like, there's so much great stuff in that movie, but because it has the Ewoks, it has this bad reputation. I don't know.
I agree with you. It happens to be my favorite of all of them.
I'm glad to. When people ask me what my favorite movie is, I always say Empire, but like Jedi is right there as well.
Yeah,
it's just sentimentally, it's like there's so much about it I love. And there's a line that it's not necessarily a clever line. It's just such a great moment, and it's so brilliantly acted. The moment of realization is when the Rebel fleet jumps out of hyperspace and to attack the Death Star, and we got to be able to get some kind of reading on that shield up or down. And then he says, well, how can they be jamming us if they don't know if we're coming? And it's that moment of him realizing that it's a setup. I got chills when I saw that for the first time. I watched that scene a lot, and Billy D. Williams delivers that line so brilliantly. And it's also just the cleverness of, you don't understand what his co-pilot is saying, but you don't need to. Like, you only need to understand one half of the conversation for it to make sense. And like, just a little moment that I love in that film.
Wow, that's a cool observation. I like that a lot too.
Yeah.
It's all in the delivery, right? With Billy D.
Go back and watch it again, and you can see the moment where the light bulb goes off in Lando's head. He's like, "Oh shit, they know we're coming." It's really, really well done.
Great answer.
All right, I think you know what question is coming next.
I have no idea.
What is your least favorite Star Wars line?
Misa Tinkin, you're gonna be saying something from Jar Jar Binks.
I'm gonna be very diplomatic here, and you're gonna be very annoyed by this answer. I can't say what it is because it's from Rogue One and it was another writer that wrote it, but I hate it. It's one line that I really hate.
Oh no!
That's the only thing. That's as far. I would never criticize another writer by name. I would never say I didn't like someone else's contribution. There's just one. Remember how I said earlier that there's just a couple of teeny tiny little bits in the film that I would have done differently. And for the most part, I absolutely love the film and all the changes. It was so much better than the script that I wrote. They made it so much better. A couple of teeny tiny little niggly things. And there's one particular line of dialogue I don't like, and maybe I don't like it less because it's in the movie that I worked on. But
yeah,
let me see. Aside from Rogue One, I don't know. You guys, it's funny. I'm trying to think of another example. Again, you know what I think it might be. And it's hard to pick just one line. But I really, as much as I love Return of the Jedi, I really struggle with the scene where Luke tells Leia that he's got to go and face Vader. Because you want to talk about clunky dialogue, and it's so melodramatic. Luke, run away, far away, leave this place. Like, it almost feels like we've gone into like a whole other level of like fairy tale. And it's just, I don't know, for the most part, again, that Return of the Jedi, again, has many of my favorite lines in it. And I think it's a brilliantly written script, but like just as like here's the thing, like I'm not trying to single out Rogue One to be shitty or anything. Like, I could point out a line in probably every Star Wars movie that irritates me, and there is one in Rogue One, just like there is one in every other film. But for the one that again, if I thought about it more and came back to you tomorrow, I might have a different answer. But off the top of my head, and maybe that's the most accurate answer, because why did your brain cough that one up and no other? It's that whole scene. It's really cheesy.
There is some melodrama in
Star Wars.
Scene.
Yeah, like I said, very melodramatic. Yeah. And then of course it's the whole sister revelation, and like the whole movie now like Mark Hamill has to hear about, oh, you kissed your sister for the rest of his life, like because they didn't plan it out, right? They didn't know from one movie to the next what was happening, and so, but when you step back and look at it, it's like, oh, that was his sister, and then the scene in Empire becomes kind of weird, when she smooches him, and it's like, I don't know, there's a little bit of the other one is I think it's okay, but when Luke realizes and he's sitting on the log with Obi-Wan and says, Leia is my sister. I just remember when I was 11 years old, like someone at the back of the audience laughed really, really hard, and that like tainted my reading of that line forever. It was like that, oh, come on, kind of lines, kind of laughs. So it's like, I didn't think it was that bad, but I was like, oh, that guy really hated it, and so it like colored my view of it ever since.
All right. All right. How about this one? What moment in Star Wars, and all of Star Wars, always makes you smile? Every time you see it, doesn't matter how many times you see it, it always puts a smile on your face.
Aside from my name in the credits?
Yes, aside from your name in the blue letters.
That's obviously that's the easy answer. Always makes me smile. Oh, I know what it is. It's also from Return of the Jedi. And it did more than make me smile. It's the whole reason, I think, or a large part of it, why I have the career that I have. Because, every filmmaker in my generation says, oh, Star Wars, the movie that made me want to be a filmmaker. And to a large extent, that's some other movies as well, but Star Wars, chief among them. But I know the exact moment that it happened for me. It's during the Battle of Endor, which again I think is still the best space battle ever on film. The sense of scale and speed that everything's moving at is incredible. And again, a lot of what we did with the Battle of Scarif was trying to replicate that feeling. When they're skimming the surface of the Death Star after the shield is down, and Lando says, "Here goes nothing," and barrel rolls inside the superstructure of the Death Star, and in one contiguous shot, suddenly you're flying inside the Death Star. As an 11-year-old kid, my brain melted. I just thought that's the coolest shit I've ever seen in my life. They are flying inside the Death Star now. Like, we're going to attack the Death Star again, but we've seen it already. Like, what's the next step up from a trench run? Well, this is the answer, and it's absolutely incredible. And just these great little moments, like when again, I'm not telling you that you've already seen. It's just a nice little moment when the TIE fighters are pursuing them through the superstructure, and Lando says, "Split up and head back to the surface and see if you can get some of those TIE fighters to follow you."
Yeah,
and you see it happen. Some of the X-wings peel off, and some of the TIE fighters peel off to follow them, and I just, oh, that is so cool. I just loved it. But I remember that barrel roll moment. That was the moment my little 11-year-old brain kind of said, "Whatever it is this movie's making me feel right now, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to make other people feel like that." And so that was kind of the moment for me.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Just two more here. What Star Wars moment always makes you sad? And not in an ironic way, in a legit.
No, actually, emotionally sad.
Gets you in the feels, as they say.
I think the death of Yoda has got to. Again, it's not like I don't have like a cool. Oh, you didn't think I was going to say this, did you? Type answer, but it is. I think it's the death of Yoda. He's such a wonderful character, and even though he had basically died, died of old age, there was just something. You love that character so much, and it's one of the great reveals in the history of cinema. And people don't give it enough credit now how well that gag works when you first meet Yoda. Like, again, you watch it now and you go, oh, there's Yoda, because he's this pop culture icon, right? But try to go back to remember what it was like when you first saw that movie. And you think it's just some little swamp gremlin, right? You never even entertain the idea this could be the great Jedi Knight. And it's that moment when you realize that he is. It's like, oh, another one of those great. And so you buy into this character, and he's so fun and he's so wise. And again, I really, really think that Yoda kind of elevated the kind of the maturity and the kind of the spirituality of, like, back in Star Wars, like the Force was just it was just like a magic trick that you could do, right? You could move things around and do mind tricks, but there was never a sense of like it's a faith, it's a religion, it's a philosophy, it's a spirituality. That only started when Yoda showed up.
That's right.
Started talking in this kind of Zen master philosophical way. Obi-Wan never talked like that. He was just he was just like Ben Kenobi. But when you know what, I'll give you another one because it speaks directly to this, and it says so much about it. Is when Luke tries to lift the X-wing out of the swamp and he can't do it, and Yoda then goes and does it with ease, and Luke says, "I can't believe it," and Yoda says, "That is why you fail." That's the philosophy of the Force, like just encapsulated in such a brilliant way. That like so many of the moments that made Star Wars, I think, truly great are Yoda moments, and so when he died, I was sad.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, the Yoda dialogue on Dagobah in Empire Strikes Back, I think, is some of the peak of Star Wars for me.
Right.
Because,
and just like that unique syntax construction that he has, that again we take for granted now. But at the time, that was like, oh wow, like he talks in this really cool way. It's wonderful. Yoda's one of the greatest creations of the Star Wars universe.
And for him to be such a profoundly spiritual character who sounded a lot like Grover from Sesame Street. That was kind of the first impression a lot of people had of Yoda was, wow, Luke's spiritual advisor is Grover. That's kind of a hurdle to overcome. Because Sesame
right,
Street,
and of course, we all know the reasons why, because the Jim Henson connection is there. But yeah, I mean that's something else. I think they almost when they're trying to pull that game on you at the beginning, when you don't know this is Yoda yet, and you think it's just some swamp creature that's like messing around in Luke's luggage, right? They lean into that, right? Because it's more funny to have him sound like Grover, mine, or I'll help you not. Like it's all very kind of, it's all very kind of Muppety and very screechy. And you'll notice that when he finally becomes Yoda, I cannot teach him. The boy has no patience. Like, oh shit, that sounds like a different guy now because he's not playing a character anymore. He is who he really is.
Yeah.
That and it's and then of course after that he sounds, so wise, right? And it's just this sense of like gravitas that comes. He's like, you should pay attention to this guy because he fucking knows what he's talking about, right? Like that. There's so much. There's just you just have like so much admiration and respect for that character.
I'll give you top marks on your Yoda impersonation too.
Yeah, that's pretty darn good.
I didn't want to do it because I thought there's no way it sounds good, but okay.
No, it sounds real good. All right, I'm going to modify this just a little bit again because you are a writer. A lot of times we're talking to actors. So I'm going to modify this last question. If there was another Star Wars feature film to be made and George Lucas was directing and he said, "Get me that Gary Whitta guy. He knows what he's doing."
Yeah, that sounds likely.
What would you like to hear him say to you after he finishes reading your script?
It feels like Star Wars.
Hey,
there you go, man. That's a great answer. That's a fantastic answer. Gary Whitta.
That was actually, well, I kind of stole it a little bit. I remember my old boss at Lucasfilm, who was the head of story development at the time, when I turned in the first draft of the script, she wrote this very complimentary note back. But the one line I always remember was she said, "It feels like Star Wars." And that, obviously that's always the goal.
That's high praise. And it's something that's very hard to describe. It's like, it when you see it or when you hear it, when it hits the right notes.
Absolutely.
Wow. Gary Whitta, thank you so much for spending more time with us here on Rebel Force Radio. We really appreciate it. Once again, for those listening, the best way to keep up with you and what's going on with your big project, Gundog, what website, what's the best source for all things Gary Whitta these days?
Yeah, so if you want to catch the live shows, it's at twitch.tv/Gary Whitta. So it's just my name, GaryWhitta. If you want to catch the episodes that have already been released, and as we record this, we have 3 out. Episode 4 will be out in a couple of days. You can go to my YouTube channel. Again, that's just YouTube/Gary Whitta, GaryWhitta. Don't forget to smash that like button and ring the bell and all the things that YouTubers are supposed to say. But you can listen to the archive versions there. And again, the main home of Gundog in the internet will be in the podcast version. Like I said, right now, currently that does exist. You can go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, type in Gundog, or you can go to gundogpodcast.com and there's a webpage that has all the links. You can follow the podcast right now. There's just a trailer and a 7-minute prologue. But once you've click that follow button or whatever, add it to your feed, the episode 1 will show up as soon as we are able to deliver it. And again, it's done. People have heard it. It's been out there on social media, on YouTube and on Twitch. We're just there's like to migrate it to this bigger podcast network. There's like some technical behind the scenes stuff that we're doing, but we're hoping within the next week or two it'll be fully armed and operational.
Well, congratulations on that and everything else. And if you ever have, on your next project, you want to come back and talk more Star Wars with us, we'd love to have you.
Listen, I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I could keep going because I love talking about Star Wars with people who love it as much as I do. So I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks, Gary. Have a great night.
You too.
Chewie, get us out of here!
All right, it's going to wrap things up here this week on Rebel Force Radio. Thanks for joining us. Huge thanks to Gary Whitta for spending so much time with us in the cantina. Great conversation with Gary. He really is, Jim. I think he's a super class act, and I'm kind of glad that movie continues. Glad for him, John Knoll, Tony Gilroy, Chris Weitz, all of them. Just glad that Rogue One continues to grow in esteem as it has since it came out in 2016.
Yeah, and really does a great job of setting the table for Andor coming up in just a few weeks. We're in September now, so we're just like 3 weeks away till Andor. And then,
and Bad Batch Season 2 is also coming.
That's right, Bad Batch. Oh, my God. It's going to be hitting us like an avalanche of Star Wars here this fall, so strap in.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot to talk about.
We can handle it. Can you handle it? Can you handle more Rebel Force Radio in your life? I bet you could. Just go to patreon.com/Rebel Force Radio or go to the RFR website and click on the Patreon banner where you can become a member of our Patreon supporters. We offer lots of benefits, various tiers available, including the weekly full show video. That's right. The podcast you're listening to now, you could watch it each and every week if you are a member of the All Access group and you hear Jimmy Mack say things like, damn it. Yes, we're making... it's stuff that you don't hear on the regular podcast. Also exclusive podcasts like the RFR Q&A, the Babu Freaks, Clone Wars Declassified Remastered. We've got Filoni Files, audio archive highlights, and so much more. Plus, when we get to the Andor after shows, you can jump to head of the queue when you are calling in for those live RFR streams and other perks. You've identified yourself as a RFR Patreon. You get pushed to the head of the line. And you're also just joining a community of some of the best and brightest Star Wars fans in the whole galaxy. Again, patreon.com/Rebel Force Radio. Also, big thanks to our sponsor this week, Backbone. Find your next adventure at playbackbone.com/rebel. And tell you something that costs you absolutely nothing, and that's our YouTube channel. All it costs you is a little bit of time. Go over there, become a subscriber, and click like on a whole bunch of videos. We prefer it if you watch them first, but we don't care. Just click like on all these videos. But we know you're going to like them. It is really a repository. It just covers, the decade and a half that we've been doing Star Wars podcasting, and tons of stuff over there. So check it out. Classic interviews, some of our parodies and bits over the recent years, and the latest live streams. All those after shows that we talked about, they're there as well. Plus new full show audio released every week. And if you want to chat with us in between shows, we'd love to hear from you. The email address, show@rebelforceradio.com. The voicemail line. We need more voicemails. Please get the voicemail. We love the emails. Star Wars fans love to write, but we would much rather have the voicemails because they're great, because we're an audio podcast. So we want to be able to play your voicemails on the air. So that's 708-3201-RFR, 708-320-17. I don't care if you even just read your email. Make it sound natural, but we'd rather have it that way. 708-320-1RFR. Also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You'll find us there as well. RebelForceRadio.com is the website. But if you want to keep Rebel Force Radio going, the best way for you to do that is to just spread the word. Keep listening. Let the friends and the Star Wars fans in your life know that you listen to RFR, and they should be too. We're streaming 24/7 anywhere you can find fine podcasts like iHeart, TuneIn, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon, Audible, Pandora, Apple, Samsung. You'll find us here at Rebel Force Radio. You'll also find us here next week. We'll see you next time. For Rebel Force Radio, I'm Jason.
And I'm Jimmy Mack.
And remember,
the Force will be with you, always.
Rebel Force Radio.
It was like watching Darth Vader take off his helmet. I'm in a total state of shock. I really am.